Okay, you see that colonies, the first colonies of Spain, you see the first colonies of Portugal, and those blue color are the colonies of Portugal, and the red ones are of Spain. And Spanish and Portuguese authorities prohibited anyone to visit these places without special permission from the from authorities, from them. Slavery, sugar, and gold and silver were the prime components of colonial economies. And as well, what we must say is that Spanish introduced the first in history racial hierarchy. They differentiated people by their blood. Creoles possessed the higher class position in that society, in colonial society. Creoles were the clear Europeans by their blood. The people which were born from the mix interbreeding between Amerindians and Europeans were called mestizos. Mestizos, half Amerindian, half European. They possess the second place in this hierarchy. Then mixes between Africans and Europeans were called mulattoes, and they possessed third place, their third position. And Samba were at the lowest position in this hierarchy. They were born from the interbreeding between Amerindians and Africans. And of course, the rights differentiated accordingly in this hierarchy. On the one hand, there was discrimination, slavery, repressions, brutal politics on the side of conquistadors there, colonialists. On the other hand, there was Columbian exchange, which began due to that colonization of Americas. I mean that some plants, some animals, they first arrived in Europe, and some plants and animals from Europe arrived in Americas. That was the cultural and economic exchange beneficial for both sides. You see that coffee, for example, cows, horses, onions, and so on were brought from Europe to Americas, while tomatoes, corn, or potato were taken from Americas and brought to Europe. The slavery was extremely hard there. People were captured in Africa and were transported in very hard conditions, were transported across Atlantic to America. Many of them died in these travels. There was even established some economic triangular trade between three continents. When slaves were taken in Africa, some cotton and sugar were produced in America and brought to Europe, and some manufactured goods were brought to America and Africa from Europe. In the 17th century, or to be more precise, from the second half of 16th century, Spain and Portugal were fighting for the colonies, for the spheres of influence with the non-Iberian countries of Europe, with England, with France, with the Netherlands. And in this struggle, in this war, non-Iberians, non-Spanish, non-Portuguese nations used joint stock companies. This joint stock company approach was accompanied with the approach of using piracy and privateering. Talking about now the privateering concept, which existed till the middle of the 19th century, this privateering was just illegal piracy. And one may distinguish two forms of this privateering existing in Europe. One of these forms is the legal, or is the public law privateering. If there was war between the states, each of these states could issue letters of marque, special licenses, which gave rights to attack enemies and rob those enemies, with paying some percent to the state for this robbery from the booty. This kind of privateering developed in 17th century and began to develop in 17th century. And another type of privateering, which was older form, was the private law privateering. It concerns the special cases, the individual cases, when, imagine the situation, if you was robbed by a foreigner at sea, so then you could go to court, go to Admiralty, and take the letter of reprisal. This reprisal allowed you to attack anyone from the country of the robber, anyone from this another country, to restitute your losses by capturing the ships of another country from which the initial pirate was, who had attacked you before. You see the difference? Reprisal and letter of marque, but usually they were used in both types of privateering. So the letter of marque could be called as well letter of reprisal and vice versa. So it's unstrict and confused the concept, but this concept was there, and this privateering was really source of piracy. Because after war, many former privateers turned to the just typical piracy, and even having the legal license in the hands, they could overdue the authorities. They could rob not only the foreigners described in this letter, they could rob everyone they met at sea, and no one could guess even who was robbed by them. So the piracy and privateering, they went together hand in hand, but only the small minority of privateers tried to follow all the rules. Only small minority. For example, the Earl of Cumberland in England, he tried to be very ideal privateer, and he condemned and blamed every piracy. The synonymous of this word is copper, for example, or corso. They are synonymous, but corso was used in Mediterranean in southern, copper was used in Netherlands, and privateers was used in England since 17th century. Before middle of the 17th century, this term wasn't in use. The famous privateers, or in pirates, Francis Drake, Thomas Cavendish, Peter Hearn from Netherlands, Jean Fleury from France, or Jean Leclerc, the wooden leg from France. and many others, many others. They reached Americas, they seized Spanish fleet, they seized Spanish ships, and you see that depiction when the Drake's ship Golden Hind attacked Spanish galleon Cacafuega in 1579. Very, very large ship with the very huge amount of gold on the board of this ship. And this practice was very crucial in enriching, in the rising of the wealth of the countries using this practice. You see that Netherlands and England and France, they penetrated into Americas, penetrated in Africa, and then even green, you see the green line symbolizing Dutch, they reached Asia. And you see the black kosa, this is the movement of Russia, of Muscovy, exploiting Siberia. There. That was the time of explorations, time of colonizations of non-Iberians. The most known joint stock companies which were responsible for the colonization exploitative activities were the Company of New France, for example, in France, the British East India Company, and the Dutch East India Company. Those companies had their own fleets, their own armies even. They acted as transnational corporations. And this is very different from what was used by Spain and Portugal, because Spain and Portugal colonized only using state resources, or governmental resources, while these countries, England, Netherlands, and France, used private capital in these colonization efforts. 17th century saw also several wars between the newly created colonialist states, wars between England and Netherlands, between France and England, between Spain and England, and so on. And in the early 17th century, some colonialist tempo was taken by Muscovy, by the Kingdom of Moscow. In the first half of 17th century, the dynasty of Romanovs came to power there, and Peter the Great became the greatest, maybe representative of this dynasty. In the late 17th century, he came to power, and then he really westernized a country. He introduced the Western style reforms. He prohibited patriarchate there and created his own religious authority. He tried to centralize his state as he could, and he tried to introduce better discipline among the elites in Moscow. Russian Empire, as it was proclaimed in 1721 by Peter I, who, by the way, in 1721 changed the name, official name of his state. If before 1721 Muscovy was known as the state of Moscow, so since that time this country was known as Russian Empire. The name Russia was introduced in its political sense. Just differentiate, please, the use of Russia as the name of Russia before, because this name was used only in religious term, in church term, meaning the community of Orthodox believers. But now it was introduced as political concept. First, after the many years without Kievan Rus.